So to begin with, really, Thomas, I sort of gave a little bit of my view of the state of the nation for brands today, but where do you think we are in terms of brand storytelling, particularly around topics like purpose and impact?
Yeah, it's an interesting time for sure. So thank you for setting that up, and thank you all for joining here today. I think in some ways it does mirror a little bit of my own journey in this space in some ways. I mean, you did mention the first book, Good Advertising, which came out in the early days of Purpose, so around 2012. So this was a time where, you know, it was much easier to cut through with these types of stories. I mean, when you had, you know, Unilever started a sustainable living plan. You had brands like Chipotle and Body Shop and others who had very single emissions that sort of looked at the Achilles heel of competitors and used that in their communication to drive some amazing stories. And that's always what I've been fascinated about. And I think you talked about the superpower. I mean, what's more interesting than good versus evil? This is like the territory of Star Wars, of the Odyssey, of Tolkien. And I think when we tell these stories well, it has an emotional impact. And we all know that what makes advertising and campaigns effective is emotions. I think where we are today, though, and I think you hinted at a little bit, and I think about 4 or 5 years ago, what we saw was a lot of people going into the space. It's almost like chasing purpose, like a Pokemon, and probably a lot of people forgot to ask themselves why we're actually doing this. And so today we're in a time where it's become a little bit harder. A lot of these topics have become more mainstream, and so what we will be seeing is obviously a bigger need for creativity, for reframing, but also fundamentally, I think where I feel from the first book to the second book was that in Good Advertising, it was almost like a moral thing. It's in the title, good. There was a moral impediment that this is right, other ways of doing this is wrong. And I think what I realized with the second book, The Hero Trap, was in fact that I built brands that was too good to be true. In many instances, suddenly there were so many heroes in the marketplace. You know, you could not go down the supermarket aisle without every brand pitching itself as Greta Thunberg or Nelson Mandela, which was not a very believable proposition. So with the Hero Trap, which is, I think, what you also hinted at a little bit, I mean, how do we get closer to ordinary people's lives? I mean, we're in a cost of living crisis. We're in a time where a lot of people might not be afraid of global warming, but, you know, some nukes or wars or other things hitting us. And so the way I reframe it is that I think we are on the way towards what would be a post-purpose market. So a market where you have to find your why in people's why. So actually becoming much more sort of mission aligned in that sense. And so I talk a lot about transformative brands and how the brands that really excel in this space look at how can we actually enable change? How can we make people healthier? How can we make them more climate conscious? And for me, that was the real BS test in the sense that there's so many brands out there that talk about change. If I can feel, hey, wait a moment, here's actually a brand that helped me live healthier. I mean, I just came off the stage of MadFest and Advertise Festival today, and I invited a Dutch brand to the States, a challenge brand called Hollies. The interesting thing is they're the breakfast cereal. They do breakfast cereals, but with zero sugar and high in fiber. And if you look at how many big brands have talked about sugar and fat, they've had the opportunity to cut their way for many years, yet they haven't done that. And then you have a brand like Hollies who can use that as a superpower and help us towards that transitioning. I have a little son. I don't want my son to grow up eating his first meal packed with sugars. So I think in that way, those brands who get this transformative difference really succeed in the marketplace. That was a very long rant, and I was trying to keep away from politics as much as humanly possible.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
For now.
And I think, yeah, well, let's come back to the politics bit, because I think there is a question about the politicization of purpose that will be worth touching on. But so you've mentioned a couple of the sort of pitfalls where brands, have kind of lost their way. And we wanted to focus at the beginning. We are going to get onto solutions and what works, but what are some of the worst habits you see, and where do brands go wrong when they're doing this? What are the biggest errors that people make? I think there has become a bit of a sense of purpose washing being a thing. So what are the most egregious errors that people are making?
I think one of the key things is, that I touch on the hero trap as well, is really just stop pretending like your brand is some sort of world-saving hero. It's sort of classic Patagonia mistake in some ways. Like, Patagonia can get away with it, but 99% of brands can't. So I think it's really getting much closer to what matters in people's lives. And the second thing is, why are we treating this as some sort of discipline that is different from any other type of advertising and storytelling? We know that price, quality, and convenience drives the market. It's the very same thing in sustainability. It's no different. So we just need to translate a lot of these messages into something that actually are triggers in the marketplace. But there are a lot of these things that go back to, we just talked about Hollies, right? If you want to have a high quality breakfast cereal, yeah, maybe get one without sugar, maybe get one that's high in fiber. That's quality. And another thing I would say is a key mistake is that, and I do a lot of judging at awards, and a lot of this communication come across as a really boring corporate social responsibility report. X% of this, our goal in 2040, 2050 is this. I have to make a choice right now. I don't wait for 2030 or 2040. I usually do this little joke, which is basically that I like to break down these really complicated issues into human relationships, because brands is about relationships between human beings. But let's say I get home from today's webinar, I get home a little bit earlier, I take my partner, she's there with another man, I get very angry, I'm like, honey, what are you doing? And she looks at me, sorry, Thomas, I'm very sorry about that. What I do promise you, though, I'll be a little bit less unfaithful up towards 2040. Most of us won't really, accept that. So I think there is this, we make these conversations very technical and very far from what we know works in advertising and storytelling, which is emotions. And why I absolutely love this space wholeheartedly is that I don't think we have anything more emotionally charged than the sustainability space. Great brands are built because people hate and love it. People burn their Nike shoes. We've had Harley Davidson fans go full on crazy with a full automatic rifle and shooting their Harley Davidsons to pieces because the COO of Harley Davidson decided to run some D&I courses. I mean, so if we're looking for a highway for emotional relevance, we got it. We're on it. So yeah. So avoid the technicality. Don't turn yourself into the hero, but turn people into the heroes. And I think the third point was, see, I can't remember the third point, but somebody did a note about that. I'm sure we can come back to it.
That's brilliant. It's interesting, the just to touch briefly on the sort of political agenda and the politicization of purpose. What advice do you have for brands and businesses that want to build purpose and impact into their storytelling, but look at, brands like Budweiser and those people who've really sort of fallen foul of the political turmoil that's happening all around us? What advice do you have for those brands?
I mean, I don't get why in the first place we made sustainability a polarizing thing. I always feel that there should be something that's there for everyone. I think we failed in many instances because we did make this into sort of a value-driven agenda, like we are better than you, vilifying farmers, pretending that we were on a high horse. Obviously, that is going to turn some people off. I mean, I grew up on a small island surrounded by fishermen and farmers. I know these folks. So I do understand why a lot of people feel that they've been alienated by this agenda, which is absolutely terrible, because the people who can benefit most from it are not necessarily affluent. but those who need to make their money last longer. And that is one of the amazing things about thinking more sustainably, is that that is a little added benefit. You actually get your resources to last longer. So I think we need a bit of reframing there. Uh, Obviously, for big brands, I think one of the mistakes they did was that um, if if you're a big brand, if you're like you mentioned Bud Light, if you're Bud Light, you're there for every American, right? So why make that into a thing that separates Americans? You need to talk to things that really unite Americans. So I think right now there's an opportunity for smaller challenger brands who have a very specific target group with very specific political values. There's a massive opportunity for, like in the US, a Trader Joe or others to stand up and fight for what you believe in. I think for a lot of the bigger brands, obviously they need to thread a lot more carefully. So if you're a Disney, for example, um, how do you find a way of making things that are a bit more inclusive, a bit more open to all your diverse target groups? So I think that's a key mistake often being made in this space, is to make it about a value-driven, mission-driven effort rather than actually thinking about what are the value for ordinary folks out there. What are they nervous about, and how can you speak to that?
Yeah. And that sort of ties nicely into the sort of next section of our agenda, which is focusing a bit more on what works, and some of your experience and tangible examples that you can give the audience of things that have and do work. And this idea that you talk about in the book of that, the brands have to stop trying to be the hero and actually, make the audience the hero of the work and the creative. And is there a particular example of that you can share, or some tips that you can give people listening of how to get into that mindset and how they work that within their business?
Yeah, I think first of all, in terms of storytelling, I think it is figuring out uh, how do you tell a story that's not just about sustainability. I mean, I can give you a very concrete example around. I mean, in Denmark, we were one of the countries who buy the most amount of organic produce. Is that about saving the world, or what is that about? And so, how do you reframe that? And one of the supermarket chains did an amazing piece of storytelling, where basically they took a family who'd even eating conventional food. They tested them and found out that obviously their bodies are full with pesticides and insecticides. Then they gave them a 2-week period only on an organic diet. Obviously, that's the amazing thing about our body. All those toxins are out of our bodies. So suddenly they're telling a much bigger story about health and well-being, and not about saving the planet. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, which I've always been a big believer in, why do we still, do these 30-second ads talking about how great our company is? I, I don't get it. Like if I at home, obviously my mom would and dad wouldn't expect me to clean up my room. I wouldn't get a lot of credit for putting up a big banner and see, Mom and Dad, I cleaned up my own mess. And I think in so many ways, that's what a lot of brands do. Look at us, we cleaned up our own mess. I'm not going to applaud that. So I think there's one key question I often test the communication with is, what is the right time and place for people to act on this message? What's the right time and place for people to act on this message? And that's 99% of the time, not your big advertising budgets. That might be the small, amazing notches that you can do. And let me give you one good example from last year in Cannes and D&AD. It was an award winner that did well. A lot of companies talk about food waste. And often again, I kind of feel like it comes off as, hey, look at us, we're doing the responsible thing, we're cutting down on food waste, etc. But let's also be honest with ourselves that a lot of these topics, we as consumers, citizens, whatever, are not always very good at doing our part either. And so a supermarket chain does this amazing thing by adding these stickers on fruit and vegetables. So, for example, a banana, they would have this label that would say, if the banana is brown, actually don't throw it away. It's amazing to make ice cream out of it. Or I love to do pancakes out of it and mash them up, throw them in the frying pan, no oil needed. It's just super tasty. Or if it's too green, what can you then do with it? So like an educational thing. So again, for me, we need to come to the point where brands become much more helpers and help us live those lives that we know the majority of us wants to live. I mean, The Guardian was just out with a project recently called the 89 Project, where they actually asked people across the world if we were willing to spend money on fighting climate change. 89% of all the citizens on this planet said, hell yeah, we want to do that. We actually want to put money towards this thing. And the most interesting thing I found was that it was not privileged countries like my own Denmark that was leading. It was a lot of the countries in global south, a lot of the people who have the least, who was actually most willing to spend, which I think is quite eye-opening as well. Obviously, part of that reason might be that they're also, unfortunately, also seeing most of the damage. Let's be real about that as well.
And how do you think, what advice would you give people who are trying to kind of articulate the argument for incorporating impact and purpose into their brand storytelling internally? How do they make the case for it?
I think, we've used stick for too long. Stick is not going to inspire anybody in an organization, and especially not marketing teams. We need more carrot. And it works. That's the thing. If you tell these stories and you tell them well, they are your little emotional superhighways. We did a study with Walk, which is effectiveness experts that look at the most effective advertising across the planet. We did a study with them that came out in May. We looked at a decade of the most effective campaigns globally, 100 most effective campaigns globally. Over that decade, 30% of those had a social or environmental component. And the reason for that is that advertising and effectiveness is driven by emotions. And so I think that the answer is pretty clear there. So I typically kind of try and show these types of facts to organizations, saying that this is just better storytelling. It's more interesting storytelling. Back to the Star Wars, if we don't have a villain, it's not a very interesting thing to watch. And so that's also why we need the reframing around who is actually the heroes of these narratives.
And do you think that we touched briefly earlier on language and the importance of language? Do you think that there is now some language that is kind of no longer going to be effective in communicating these kind of topics? Is there language that's now so politicized and so polarized that we have to kind of, marketers and communicators need to leave it to one side?
I think we should just all agree to have a swear bucket, and every time we mention the word sustainability, we put down a pound or a euro or a Danish crown or whatever it might be. I think sometimes we're just too lazy to actually translate things into something meaningful. I think Paulus once said, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. We just don't do our groundwork well enough. I mean, a lot of these conversations, I mean, as you said, Russ, you've been in this business for many years. We've had these conversations many times before. It's not that we haven't talked about reframing before. Obviously, things like climate, things that are kind of feel far away, doesn't really move us. We know that it needs to be near and dear. It's the principle of journalism. It's the principles of good storytelling, and that's not changed in the sustainability field either. So we need to sort of think about how do we take these complex issues and bring them home to the dinner table, to things that people really want to talk about. And there's so many things that really truly matter. I mean, I can give you an example from my own life. My youngest niece, she plays football. She's 13. She's got elected to the national team. It's amazing. She get paid, I don't know, a 10th, a 20th of her male counterparts. Does that provoke my sense of fairness? It does, and that's emotional, and it's something that can get me up from the chair and want to discuss that and talk about that around the dinner table. And that's why these topics, if we do translate something like diversity, equity, and inclusion into something that just speaks to me, speaks to the regular guy on around the block who got kids. I mean, it's that simple. So I think we just forget, and that's also why I'm sometimes a little bit frustrated about all these conversations we keep having around greenwashing, about how to make sustainability relevant. We have the answers. I think now it's just time that we start acting on them.